Hello, I am Benito Mussolini, and I would like to share my story with you. I was born on July 29, 1883, in the northern Italian town of Predappio. My mother, Rosa, a devout Roman Catholic and a school teacher, provided a better standard of living for our family than the rest of Predappio's population. We were allowed to make our home within the school building during my adolescence. My father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith and an ardent left-wing socialist. He named me after Benito Juarez, the left-wing president of Mexico, who was his idol. I often attended local political meetings with my father, which undoubtedly influenced my early years. Considering my mother's profession, one might assume that I would have had an advantage over other children in my age group. However, my parents were concerned about my inability to speak and initially feared that I was mute. My mother's patient tutelage eventually helped me overcome this obstacle, and I proved to be an intelligent young man. In contrast, my father Alessandro was not as caring or responsible as my mother Rosa. He was often away from home and reckless with money, prioritizing his needs and desires over those of his family. Even so, I idolized him. Perhaps as a result, I gained a reputation as a pest or bully during my childhood, making fun of other children in my class and pinching people during church services, causing them to cry out in pain for no apparent reason. In 1892, at the age of 8, I was sent to a Catholic boarding school where I performed well academically. My rebellious streak soon resurfaced as I became an unruly pupil who bullied my fellow students and used violence and intimidation to get my own way. This behavior landed me in trouble at my new school, and I was expelled for stabbing another pupil with a pocket knife. After attending several more schools and facing expulsion again, I eventually earned a teaching diploma in 1901. However, I quickly realized that the teaching profession was not for me. Over the next few months, I indulged my love of drink and women by visiting local brothels, but was soon forced to leave Italy for Switzerland in 1902, partly to escape military service. After securing work as a laborer, I started attending socialist meetings in the Swiss town of Lausanne. It was around this time that my gift for oratory began to manifest itself, and I quickly became a leading figure within the far-left circles in Lausanne. Yet, I once again gained a reputation for bullying and intimidating my fellow socialists, often browbeating them into submission. During this period, I also began working as a writer for a socialist newspaper called The Future of the Workers, run by Italian immigrants in Switzerland. The profession of journalism would grant me both the platform and opportunity to gain notoriety over the coming decades, and eventually lead me to become a prominent political figure within Italy. Heavily influenced by my father, who despised the Italian monarchy and capitalism, I regularly called for the overthrow of democracy by violent means. This resulted in my arrest for political agitation by the Swiss authorities. During this period, I frequently argued against religion, particularly the Catholic Church, as well as conscription into the armed forces, which I had fled Italy to avoid. I also claimed to oppose state censorship, which would ironically later become one of my most effective means of control. I returned to Italy in 1904 after an amnesty was declared for deserters of military service. This led to nearly 5 years of relative obscurity, during which I once again took a job as a schoolmaster. However, I soon grew tired of living a normal life and returned to my previous existence of extreme left-wing politics in 1909. I became the editor of local socialist newspapers in northeastern Italy before moving to Milan at the age of 26. In 1914, I moved in with a young woman named Rachel Guidi, whom I had fallen in love with in 1909. She was also born in my hometown of Predappio and was 7 years my junior. We would go on to have 5 children together, later marrying in a civil ceremony in 1915. We would also renew our vows in a religious service after my rise to power in an effort to appease church-going Italians. I had been writing articles for various socialist newspapers for some time and was quickly becoming recognized as a rising influence within socialist circles. Indeed, I was one of the first politicians to fully realize the potential the printed word could have in spreading ideas, not to mention its potential for increasing my own fame and celebrity. I was not only a gifted speaker, but also a talented writer. This newfound talent prompted me to start my own newspaper, La Lotta di Classe, or the class struggle, which gained me such notoriety that I was appointed in 1912 as the editor of the foremost socialist newspaper in Italy, Avanti. Under my guidance, Avanti soon more than doubled its readership. I voiced my anti-militaristic, anti-nationalist, and anti-imperialist views and initially argued against Italy's potential intervention in the First World War. Soon after, I changed my views regarding Italy's involvement in the conflict and began writing articles expressing my support for the war. I subsequently resigned from the editorship of Avanti and was expelled from the Italian Socialist Party. This was perhaps one of the most important turning points in my life, as I now began to embrace nationalism rather than socialism, later merging the two ideologies into my most notorious creation, fascism. I then took the editorship of another newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, or the People of Italy, which I would use to form and voice my growing nationalistic views over the coming years. The paper was backed by powerful Italian arms manufacturers and the French government, who both wanted Italy to join the conflict against the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. With the support of these powerful patrons, I continued to argue for intervention in the conflict until, in May 1915, Italy joined the Western Allies and declared war on the Central Powers. However, despite my celebrity status, I was drafted into the Italian army. According to accounts, I served with distinction and fought against the Austrians for 9 months before being wounded by an accidental mortar explosion. After a long period of convalescence, I left the army to resume the editorship of Il Popolo d'Italia at the behest of its rich patrons. It is perhaps fair to say that, much like my fellow fascist dictator Adolf Hitler, my experiences of frontline combat during the First World War did much to harden my nationalistic outlook. I returned to an Italy that was, in the immediate post-war period, crippled by widespread unemployment and growing unrest among the population. This resulted in polarization between the country's political groups and led to the upper and middle classes becoming ever more concerned by the potential threat of the revolutionary far left. I used my influence as editor of a national newspaper to exploit this polarization by arguing for the need for a man who, in my own words, was ruthless and energetic to make a clean sweep. This would eventually culminate in me forming the Revolutionary Fascist Party, which was initially comprised of people of various political persuasions, such as discontented socialists and former Italian soldiers, in order to combat the growing threat of the country's communists. The word fascism itself comes from the Italian fasci, which was a symbol of authority in ancient Rome, consisting of an axe head surrounded by a bundle of sticks. These were carried by the attendants of magistrates who kept order in public meetings and administered punishments on offenders. My followers and I, who wore black shirts, then began to use violent tactics to crush any opposition to our ideology over the coming months. The fascist movement soon grew into a large-scale organization, culminating in U.S. holding regular mass rallies in which I would use my grasp of the written word as well as my bombastic, self-confident persona to woo and persuade the masses. It is perhaps no surprise that the fascists gained an upper hand in Italy during this period, as the country's population, on the whole, had a religious conservative outlook. As Italy was in the center of the Roman Catholic world, it is also perhaps no surprise that the far right was aided against the left by the establishment, who feared that a communist revolution might lead to the downfall of the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church itself. This grand swell of right-wing sentiment, combined with my aggressive tactics and journalistic propaganda machine, soon resulted in the socialists being crushed throughout the country. By the time of the early 1920s, the fascists were arguably the dominant political force within Italy. As the majority of my major opponents were now dealt with, I increasingly turned my attention to the government, or rather the overthrow or taking over of the government, which had done little to interfere with the state of upheaval that I had in part created. The government was dominated by moderate middle-class liberals who feared the far left more than they did the fascists. My power and influence within Italy grew even further when the Revolutionary Fascist Party won 35 seats in the Italian parliament during the 1921 elections. Afterwards, I agreed with my fellow fascist leaders to change the name of the movement to the National Fascist Party at the Third Fascist Congress in November 1921. By this time, the far right had effectively eliminated or replaced the vast majority of the country's union. However, when the last vestiges of the socialist trade union movement called an anti-fascist general strike in July 1922, I gave the government an ultimatum that if they did not crush the unrest, the fascists would save the state. This strike was eventually ended, and then at a gathering of some 30,000 party members in Naples on October 22, 1922, I stated that the government would be given to us or we would seize it by marching on Rome. This was met with rapturous applause and cries of approval from my masked supporters. I then, along with my party leaders, resolved to march on the Italian capital 4 days later. But I still hoped for a relatively peaceful takeover of power, as the Italian monarch, Victor Emmanuel III, was still the country's head of state, and I needed the king to summon me to take control. A violent takeover of the monarchy and government would not have been popular in Italy, to say the least. The fascist march on Rome began on October 28, 1922, which prompted the Italian government under Luigi Facta to ask the king to declare a state of siege. This would have resulted in the Italian army attempting to put down the fascist march. But Victor Emmanuel refused to sign such an order, probably fearing that the monarchy would be overthrown if the fascists defeated the Italian army. The king then asked me to form a cabinet on October 29, 1922, leading to my arrival in Rome on the same day. After that, I held a triumphant parade of my masked black shirts through the city, and I was officially recognized and appointed as head of government on October 31. I was now the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Italy, and I would later call my seizure of power a conquest. But as King Emmanuel was still the head of state and technically my superior, I was still bound by the country's constitution, which would later become the instrument of my dismissal and the downfall of my fascist regime. Additionally, I was only the leader of a coalition government at this time, which was comprised of many liberals from more moderate political parties. Despite the growing oppression and political control I enjoyed, the country experienced a relatively calm period. This was perhaps due to the fact that many people within Italy welcomed my premiership, as they were tired of the constant strikes and unemployment, which I now resolved to alleviate. However, the end to the chaos would in time come at the price of the end of Italian democracy, which would, over the coming decade, be demolished in favor of a fascist police. The rise to power of the fascists was not without repercussions, which is perhaps best demonstrated by the kidnapping and murder by my black shirts of the Socialist Party deputy Giacomo Matteotti in 1924, which severely damaged my reputation. Despite this setback, I managed to hold on to power, even though there was little doubt that I had sanctioned the murder. After a public outcry, I was forced to act by arresting 3 suspects from within the fascist party, only one of whom served any time in prison. When I first came to power, my coalition government adopted an economic policy based on free trade and tax reform, which was headed by the talented liberal finance minister Alberto Di Stefani. This culminated in the country benefiting from economic growth and low unemployment over the next few years. This nationwide improvement is perhaps best exemplified by the famous saying that I was the man who made the trains run on time. This could perhaps be explained by the fact that most trains had fascist guards on board, while the more profitable and prestigious main lines of the country's railway network received large amounts of investment, and the country's branch lines were left in a state of disrepair. However, this upturn in the Italian economy was not destined to last, as Di Stefani was dismissed after a devaluation of the Italian lira in 1925. After that, I acted to take a greater degree of control of the Italian economy, which was an act that may have been made more likely by the fascists gaining a majority within the Italian parliament in the general election of 1924, which some say was rigged. This apparent validation of my government, combined with my newfound majority within the Italian parliament, enabled me on December 24, 1925, to pass the so-called Christmas Eve law, which effectively made me accountable only to the king and ended any say Parliament had in the rule of the country. This consolidation of power now prompted me to further extend my control over the entire country by finally outlawing any political opposition. No citizen could hold any government or civil service position unless they carried the card of the fascist party. In conjunction with this, I began, from 1925 onwards, to be known by the title of Il Dux, or the leader of fascism, amongst other grandiose titles, including head of government and His Excellency, although to the wider world I was still largely known as the Italian Prime Minister. Although many people in the modern world view fascism and communism as polar opposites in terms of ideology, it should be noted that the two forms of governance share many similarities as well as their obvious differences. I myself had, after all, spent much of my early life as an ardent follower of the ideas of Karl Marx. Therefore, it could be said that in many ways, my ideological brainchild fascism was born out of socialism, or at least was a mutation of it, or even a reaction to it, with nationalism being the major difference between the two. This is perhaps best exemplified in my Italy and in National Socialist Germany, by the fact that both regimes embraced socialist ideas in the running of their respective states. In simple terms, this meant that nothing happened within the country without the government's approval. However, both nations still incorporated a kind of highly regulated or controlled capitalism within their respective borders, in which private companies worked under the direction of the Italian state rather than being consumed or run by the state entirely, such as in the Soviet Union. Despite these differences, I slowly increased my control or interference in virtually every aspect of the Italian economy from 1925 onwards until 1934. I stated that 3/4 of the Italian economy, industry and agriculture, lay in the hands of the state, meaning that Italy was second only to the Soviet Union in terms of its nationalization. This included the government having control over which crops were grown on Italian farms, which often led to a surplus of certain types of produce, as well as shortages in others. When the Great Depression hit the Italian economy particularly hard in the early 1930s, the collapse of the banking system inevitably resulted in further mistrust of capitalism, leading to the state extending its influence over virtually every sector of the Italian economy. This increased control has led some to claim that my gradual nationalization of the Italian economy was born out of socialistic principles. But on the other hand, others have argued that my increasing interference in the Italian economy was nothing more than a power grab, as taking control of the country's collapsed banks, as well as the country's agriculture and heavy industry, did nothing but grant me near total dictatorship. However, this control was in fact an illusion, as the bailouts of the banks had already been paid for by massive loans, which were more often than not obtained from foreign sources, which did nothing but increase Italy's national debt through the roof, and meant that higher interest payments on its loans were inevitable, which the government would struggle to repay, as the country and the Italian population could not afford the necessary taxes. For example, in the year of the fascist rise to power in 1922, the Italian national debt stood at around 93 billion lira, whereas 12 years later it had ballooned to 148 billion until in 1943, at the height of Second World War, the figure stood at a staggering 405 billion. This lack of cash was only made worse by the fact that nearly 50% of the Italian workforce was employed in low-paid agricultural jobs during the 1930s, with only 4 working in heavy industry, which I was desperate to rectify in order to transform Italy into an industrial power. This could perhaps explain the later inability of my Italy to sustain an industrialized war economy, and could also explain the relatively poor quality of the majority of the equipment the Italian armed forces relied on during the Second World War, which was often inferior to those used by its enemies and indeed its allies. As with many, if not all, fascist and socialist governments, long-term prosperity was often sacrificed for short-term gain in the shape of state-funded projects. But the root problem still remained, however, that being the relative weakness of the Italian private sector economy, which was now crushed in favor of an incompetent state-run economy. But the main goal for me at this stage was to maintain and increase my own power, and also at least be seen to be making things better in the short term, which, thanks to my propaganda machine, initially succeeded in convincing both those at home and overseas of the effectiveness of fascism in bringing both order and prosperity to the Kingdom of Italy. However, the Great Depression and the fast-approaching World War would first weaken, then lay bare this facade of strength, as the Italian economy was simply not strong enough to take the strain of these major events. It could even be said that Italy at this time had become the mirror image of me, as both I and my country's power from the outside at least, seemed to be considerable, when in reality, we were both deceptively weak, or at least deeply flawed. But not everyone in Italy was prepared to submit to my rule, and various attempts were made on my life during the late 1920s, including on one occasion when I came within inches of being killed when a pistol bullet grazed my nose. Despite these attempts on my life, my fascist party had effectively silenced any and all opposition by the early 1930s, as by this stage my power and influence were unrivaled and nearly all political opposition had either been silenced or forced underground. This control is perhaps best exemplified by the complete stranglehold I enjoyed over the Italian mass media by the 1930s, which culminated in me making myself the supreme editor of the press within Italy. And I would, on a daily basis, review the nation's newspapers, after which I would promote articles I approved of, but also stop any news I deemed to be inappropriate, with potentially dire consequences for the journalist responsible. But with this control and power came a sense of invulnerability, as well as a reaffirmation of my self-imposed superiority and ego, as I began to more and more see myself as a Caesar-like figure who was destined to make my country the regional and world power I felt it deserved to be. This period of the late 1920s, in which my reputation was never higher, soon gained me the adoration and praise of many of Europe's fellow far-right parties, and the leader of one of these, Adolf Hitler, even wrote to me asking for an autograph around this time, which was subsequently turned down as unbeknownst to me, the Italian dictator. Hitler would in time effectively become the master not only of his fate, but also that of Italy's as well. My rise to power had been a great inspiration to Hitler during his struggle to secure power himself in Germany during the late 1920s. And the Führer had in many ways modeled his own Nazi party on my fascists and would in time draw inspiration from my example with regard to his suppression of political opposition and control of the press, which the Third Reich's propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels would improve on master over the coming years. Despite my earlier rebuff to Hitler, I was soon forced to take the Nazis seriously after the party's rise to power in Germany in 1933, resulting in me a year later inviting Germany's new Führer to a state visit of Italy, in which Hitler was greeted with typical Italian fascist pomp and pageantry. Much to his displeasure, as he had only requested an informal meeting with me, the Italian dictator, this frosty relationship was temporarily thawed by my ability to speak fluent German. But despite this, I would in private claim that I did not like Hitler, describing him as paranoid. And our relations were then severely damaged the year after Hitler's visit, when my ally, the Chancellor of Austria, Engelbert Dollfuss, was assassinated by Nazi supporters in July of 1934. Hitler wanted to bring his homeland of Austria under his control, but the murder of my ally prompted me to threaten war with Germany. And I then, after the assassination, moved Italian troops to Italy's border with Austria, which temporarily produced the desired effect until ultimately Germany and Austria were unified in 1938. Over the coming years, I worked to improve relations with as many nations as possible and would often call Hitler a genius in public, but insult him in private, and also told the French and British I was with them in their opposition to Nazi Germany. This was perhaps an intelligent strategy, as it kept my options open in the event of a European war, but my judgment would later backfire, as I would eventually end up on the losing side. Another of my titles had been, since the mid-20s, founder of the empire. The only problem being that the Italian Empire at this time consisted of the North African colony of Libya, Eritrea, on the Red Sea coast, and Somalia, on the western African coast of the Indian Ocean. It was because of the relatively small size of Italy's overseas colonies, combined with the desire to attain more natural resources for Italy's industrial sector, that lay at the heart of my territorial ambition. And I soon identified what I thought would be an easy first target, that being Ethiopia, which was an ancient but poor kingdom that lay between Italian Eritrea and Somalia, which to me seemed to be an easily obtainable outlet for my imperialist ambitions. Therefore, on October 3, 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia, and by May of 1936, they had captured its capital, Addis Ababa, after which I proclaimed an Italian victory. But sporadic fighting would continue within the country for the next 6 years, in which my forces committed various war crimes, including the killing of entire Ethiopian villages and the use of poison gas, which had been banned under international agreement since 1925. After the fall of Addis Ababa, I claimed that the conquest of Ethiopia was a great victory, but it was funded by yet more borrowing and proved the relative weakness of Italy's armed forces against an inferior enemy. But despite this, I was convinced of both the superiority of my army's fighting abilities as well as my own brilliance as a military leader, which gave me a false sense of security and confidence going forward. In September of 1937, Adolf Hitler invited me to a state visit of Germany, which I no doubt arrived at feeling that I was meeting with an equal in Hitler, given my recent conquests. But I soon realized that Hitler's Germany was well on the way to surpassing my own country in terms of its infrastructure, organization, state control, and most importantly, its military, which was fast becoming one of the best in Europe, if not the world. An immediate sign of change in the balance of power can arguably be seen shortly after my visit to Germany, as upon returning to Italy, I enacted new laws to severely restrict the rights and freedoms of the country's Jewish population, which overnight saw Jews throughout Italy being treated as pariahs. And I then ordered the printing of anti-Semitic newspaper articles in order to appease Nazi Germany. From this point on, I would become more and more subservient and intimidated by the ever-growing strength of Hitler's Third Reich, and even ordered my own soldiers to adopt the Nazi goose step in parades as I began to align myself more and more with my northern neighbor. It is fair to say at this stage that I had calculated that Hitler was stronger than the Western allies of France and Britain, and thusly sought to align myself with the Fuhrer. But in doing so, I more and more played second fiddle to Hitler, who was now on a collision course with the Western allies, and in aligning myself with the Third Reich, I bound both my own fate as well as that of my countries to Nazi Germany, for better or for worse. For the time being, however, Germany was in the ascendancy, and in the lead-up to Second World War, I oversaw the agreement between Nazi Germany, Britain, and France, which handed over the Sudetenland areas of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. In the Munich Agreement of 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had asked my government to help persuade Hitler not to embark on his planned invasion of Czechoslovakia, after which I telegraphed the Führer, telling him that whatever happened, I would be on his side, but also asked for a delay to the start of the German invasion in the hope that a peaceful resolution could be found. The four premiers of Germany, Italy, France, and Britain then met on September 29, 1938, at which an agreement was reached to hand over the Sudetenland areas of Czechoslovakia to Germany on the condition that Hitler did not seek any more territorial conquests on the continent. This conference was hailed as a success by Neville Chamberlain, who proclaimed that Munich had secured peace in our time. But unbeknownst to Chamberlain, Hitler was still bent on militaristic expansion, and in backing down over Czechoslovakia, the Western Allies did nothing but convince both Hitler and me of their relative weakness. Ultimately, Germany reneged on the Munich Agreement 6 months later by annexing the remainder of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939, which made war virtually inevitable, as Hitler now had designs of further conquest to the east in the shape of Poland, which would be the spark that would light the fire that was the Second World War. Emboldened and perhaps envious of Hitler's success, I then ordered Italian forces to invade Albania in April 1939, which after 5 days proved to be successful, and having now shown myself to be Germany's true diplomatic and military partner. Both Hitler and I then formalized their alliance on May 22, 1939, by signing the Pact of Steel Treaty, which, for better or for worse, meant that Italy's fate was now irrevocably tied to that of Germany. In signing this agreement, I had gambled that Hitler would be victorious in any forthcoming war. But despite the grandiose title of the Pact of Steel, the treaty was largely a one-sided affair, as I would, in reality, only commit my armies to fighting the Western Allies when I felt sure victory was certain. This reluctance to join the war immediately was largely due to the fact that Italy's armed forces were still not ready for prolonged conflict, and I also hoped that the Führer would delay the commencement of hostilities until I was ready. However, Hitler was working to his own timetable, and after formalizing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union on August 23, 1939, he gave the go-ahead for the invasion of Poland on September 1, which prompted both Britain and France to declare war on Germany 2 days later. Despite Hitler's successful invasion of Poland, I continued to wait to see how Germany's forces would fare against the Western Allies. But after the Führer's swift advance across France in the summer of 1940, I feared that Italy would be eclipsed by Hitler's Germany. And even though my armed forces were not yet ready, I, the Italian dictator, felt emboldened enough to join the conflict and declared war on the Allies on June 10, 1940. Shortly before this, on May 29, 1940, I had finally persuaded the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel, who was technically the supreme commander of the country's armed forces, to hand over his authority to me. And on June 11, the king gave a proclamation which named me as Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, operating on all fronts. After the armistice was signed, completing France's surrender on June 22, 1940, I predicted that Britain would itself soon be overwhelmed, but its successful withdrawal of over 300,000 troops from Dunkirk in the lead-up to the fall of France had allowed the island nation to reinforce both its home defenses as well as those of its empire. Perhaps the most crucial of these was Egypt and the Suez Canal, which was not only the fastest route from Britain to India and the Far East, but was also a gateway to the Middle East, which was the source of the vast majority of Britain's oil supply. This meant that losing Egypt would almost certainly force Britain to seek peace terms with the Axis powers, of which Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was well aware. And in the weeks after the Dunkirk evacuation, he sent considerable reinforcements to Egypt in the build-up to Italy's attempted invasion. I had long dreamt of resurrecting the Roman Empire, as I wanted the Mediterranean Sea to become an Italian lake. And as France was no longer a threat in the region and Britain was greatly weakened after the fall of France, I calculated that this was the time to strike. I then ordered the Italian 10th Army to cross the Libyan-Egyptian border on September 9 and 10, 1940, after which it advanced towards Alexandria and Cairo. But despite early successes, the Italian forces were met and pushed back by British forces under Archibald Wavell in the humiliating defeat that was Operation Compass, effectively ending my hopes for establishing a new Roman Empire in a matter of months, during which I lost some 150,000 troops, dead, wounded, and captured. While this encounter was taking place, it became commonplace for entire Italian divisions to surrender to the British in their thousands, as many of my soldiers were conscripts who had little desire to die fighting in my war. And this was a pattern that would come to repeat itself across North Africa, Russia, and Italy itself, as my troops were not nearly as motivated, equipped or trained as Hitler's armed forces. I had, in short, overestimated my troops' willingness to fight and greatly underestimated the capabilities of my enemies to resist me, which in turn severely damaged Germany's own chance of success in the Second World War, as they now had to prop up their weakened allies, who were now little more than a liability. Although we often think of the North African campaign as being dictated by the brilliance of the commanders involved, such as Erwin Rommel and Bernard Montgomery, in reality, what really decided the outcome of the African and Mediterranean campaigns was the struggle for domination of the skies and the Mediterranean Sea itself. At the start of the war, Italy had boasted one of the most modern and powerful fleets in the world, which I had intended to use to secure supply shipments to and from North Africa and simultaneously wrestle control of the Mediterranean from the British Royal Navy. The Italian fleet by this time far outnumbered and outmatched the British Mediterranean fleet and consisted of scores of powerful modern warships, including 7 battleships, 11 cruisers, 61 destroyers, and over 100 submarines against the 4 battleships, 6 light cruisers, and 20 destroyers of the Royal Navy. This meant that to defeat the Italians, the British would have to use every trick in the book. And the Royal Navy was fortunate that the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean fleet, Andrew Brown Cunningham, or Abe C as he was known, was one of the most capable admirals of the entire Second World War. Cunningham, whose ships were older, slower, and outgunned by Italy's modern battleships, knew that he needed to inflict a decisive blow on his enemy as soon as possible in order to secure Britain's own supply shipments in the Mediterranean, and thusly devised a plan to cripple the Italian fleet in one fell swoop by attacking its main naval base at Taranto in southeast Italy. This attack then commenced on November 11 and 12, 1940, in which the British assaulted the docked Italian fleet at Taranto with 21 obsolete Swordfish torpedo bombers, and after the chaos of the attack had died down, 1 Italian battleship had been sunk and 2 more were heavily damaged. This raid marked the beginning of the end of the age of the battleship and gave the Japanese Imperial Navy fresh inspiration for their own forthcoming attack on the United States naval base in Pearl Harbor, in which they also used carrier-borne aircraft to attack their enemy's fleet at anchor. The biggest loser of the raid at Taranto was undoubtedly myself, as the strength of the Italian Navy in terms of its capital ships was halved overnight. And this loss was then further compounded by the Italians losing another engagement with the Royal Navy in the Battle of Cape Matapan in March of 1941, in which Cunningham once again defeated the Italian Navy, meaning that it never again posed a threat to British supremacy in the Mediterranean. After my invasion of Egypt had failed, I ordered the invasion of Greece through Albania in October of 1940, which led to another military disaster in which the Italians lost another 100,000 troops. Hitler had by this time lost all confidence in me as his ally, and realizing that his alliance with my Italy was now more of a hindrance rather than a help, resolved to send his own German troops to rectify the Italian reversals in Greece and North Africa, which crucially delayed his plan. Invasion of the Soviet Union, and perhaps was the root cause of Hitler's failure to capture Moscow before the onset of the Russian winter in late 1941. To rectify what he saw as my blunders, the Führer then issued Directive 22 on January 11, 1941, in which he sent the Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel to intervene in North Africa in February, and also diverted more troops to secure Greece in April. Over the next 2 years, Rommel caused chaos in North Africa, meaning that the Italians increasingly took a back seat across the Mediterranean until the Africa Corps was itself decisively defeated in the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt in 1942, and was forced into a fighting retreat until Tunisia finally fell in a pincer movement between the British and the newly arrived Americans in May of 1943. The fall of North Africa, as well as America now sending large numbers of troops to Europe, made Italy, and particularly Sicily, a prime target for Allied invasion, which then began on July 10, 1943, with Operation Husky. And after a brief fight, which lasted just over a month, Sicily fell. And the Allies then wasted no time by starting the invasion of mainland Italy itself a month later. My health was in decline by this time, as the gravity of my mistakes became more and more apparent to me, and as I was now out of control of events, steps were then taken to remove me from office. Ultimately, the Italian Fascist Grand Council voted to replace me on July 25, 1943. And afterwards, King Victor Emmanuel summoned me to Rome and told me that the war was lost. He then appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as prime minister. After this, I was arrested and imprisoned, but Hitler had by this time determined to occupy Italy himself in the summer of 1943 in order to halt any Allied advance, and thus moved German troops into the country, while the Allies in turn advanced north from southern Italy to meet them. Despite my massive mistakes and incompetence, Hitler would ultimately remain loyal to me and determined to rescue his old ally, who was being held in the Campo Imperatore, a mountain resort in central Italy east of Rome. The Führer then sent a force of paratroopers and gliders to rescue me in the Gran Sasso raid on September 12, 1943, which was a complete success, and I was taken back to Germany without a shot being fired in a small Storch airplane which was capable of short takeoffs and landing. Before my rescue, Prime Minister Badoglio had signed an armistice with the Allies on September 3, 1943, but was now forced by Hitler's occupation of the northern half of Italy to declare war on Germany in October in support of the Western Allies. Hitler then appointed me as the leader of a German puppet state in northern Italy named the Italian Social Republic in September 1943, and the country was now firmly divided in two, with my Nazi-backed state in the north, along with the Kingdom of Italy backed by the Western Allies in the south. I was now completely under Hitler's thumb by this stage and had little say in the war's conduct or outcome in my own country, which itself proved to be a bloody struggle through the hilly and rough terrain of Italy, earning the campaign the nickname of Hitler's tough old gut. The outcome of the war was now inevitable, however, and Rome soon fell to the Allies on June 4, 1944, which was overshadowed by the D-Day landings 2 days later. After this, the Germans were forced to withdraw north, where they once again stood firm. I was now a shadow of my former self by this time, and was effectively a prisoner rather than an ally, as I was now under a 24-hour SS guard who monitored my telephone calls and restricted my movements. The fighting in Italy was in many ways a sideshow to the Eastern Front and the Allies' advance through France, and therefore the Italian campaign continued at a snail's pace for the next few months until the Germans were finally forced to withdraw from the majority of the country in the later winter and spring of 1945. During this retreat, I hoped to accompany a group of German soldiers north in order to get across the Swiss border, after which I also planned to find my way to the relative safety of fascist Spain. But I was soon discovered hiding in the back of a truck by a group of pro-communist partisans on April 27, 1945, and was afterwards taken into custody. I was then transported along with my mistress Clara Petazzi to the village of Giulino di Mezzaghe, where we spent our last night alive. And then, a day later, on April 28, 1945, I, Benito Mussolini, was shot by a firing squad along with my mistress and a number of my followers. Our corpses were then taken to Milan, where they were strung up in front of a crowd of thousands until they were cut down and dragged through the streets while being spat on and kicked by the angry mob. Afterward, my body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Musacco Cemetery in Milan, and later reburied in my hometown of Predappio, where it remains to this very day. The vast majority of the Italian people, whose country had now been devastated by the war, did not mourn my passing. In the years following Second World War, democracy was restored to Italy, resulting in the new neo-fascist party of Italy, receiving only 2 of the vote in the elections of 1948. During my lifetime, I, Benito Mussolini, went from being a schoolteacher to founding fascism and attempting to recreate the Roman Empire by joining with Adolf Hitler in Second World War, in which I gambled both my own future, as well as that of the country I love. In my dictatorship of Italy, I built a police state that rivaled those of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin as my control over Italy was near. Total, having crushed all opposition and eliminated anyone who I considered to be a threat. I am also considered to be responsible for tens of thousands of deaths and executions within Italy, which were carried out on my instructions. And it is also claimed that during my invasion of Ethiopia, my troops committed war crimes and murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. There has been a great deal of debate since my downfall regarding my true intentions during Second World War. As some claim, I was a mere opportunistic ruler who sought to capitalize on the weakness of my enemies to seize territory and power, while others claim I was an intelligent, calculating dictator who backed the right side in June 1940, but ultimately fell due to my allies' blunders as well as my own. There are also questions regarding my personality, as some have claimed that I showed narcissistic traits, while others state that my wars were not vanity projects designed to swell my ego, but were instead born out of a need to unite my country against its enemies and in the process draw the Italian population's attention away from the country's ailing economy. Even though I was the founder of fascism, I was, in the end, eclipsed by my one-time admirer, Adolf Hitler, and ultimately became his servant, as did Italy itself. But both Hitler and I shared a common downfall. Our arrogance proved to be our undoing, as we started wars we could not hope to win, which ultimately resulted in both of us, along with fascism itself, being finally defeated in the spring of 1945.